The night Marcus Hill signed his $12 million NBA deal, the cameras were blinding. They shoved microphones in his face. "Marcus, what's the first thing you're gonna buy?" He wiped sweat from his brow, paused, and said softly, "Nothing. Not yet." Because 2,000 miles away in South Side Chicago, his mother Denise was heating canned soup on a gas stove that clicked twice before catching fire. Still living in the same apartment she raised him in. Same cracked linoleum, same busted radiator, same smell of bleach and cigarette smoke. He had millions. But the door to that world, he hadn't opened it in over a year. And the guilt was louder than any stadium cheer. Marcus Hill was born on the south side of Chicago, in a part of the city where dreams rarely made it past the concrete walls of public housing and the cold metal bars of broken-down playgrounds. His childhood unfolded in a one-bedroom apartment on the fourth floor of a red-brick building that smelled of mildew, fried food, and cigarette smoke. The elevator hadn't worked since before he could remember, and the hallway lights flickered like dying stars. Every day, he passed the same cracked window in the stairwell, the same graffiti-tagged walls, and the same neighbors arguing over nothing and everything. The outside world didn't care much about kids like Marcus. He was another brown-skinned boy in a city full of them, moving through the background noise of police sirens, barking dogs, and distant gunshots that echoed like punctuation in the night. School wasn't a sanctuary, it was just a slightly cleaner version of the streets. His classrooms were overcrowded, textbooks outdated, and teachers tired. Still, he showed up, not because he believed in the promise of education, but because his mother made sure he did. Denise Hill was a woman carved from endurance. She worked 2 jobs, rarely smiled, and walked with a slight limp from years of being on her feet. Her presence was a quiet force, like gravity, unseen, constant, inescapable. Marcus's father had vanished before he turned 4. No letters, no visits, no voice. Just an old photograph tucked into a shoebox under Denise's bed. The absence became a kind of ghost, a hole in Marcus's story that he tried not to think about. There were men in the neighborhood who tried to step in and fill that role, but none of them stayed. They either got locked up, moved away, or died. Trust was not a currency Marcus dealt in. What he did trust was movement, the way his body could glide, leap, twist, run. Before he ever touched a basketball, he understood that staying still meant becoming a target. Movement was survival. The first basketball hoop he ever used was a bent rim nailed above a garage door 2 blocks away. The backboard was warped plywood, and the net was long gone. His ball was a hand-me-down with faded panels and barely enough air to bounce. But it didn't matter. He spent hours there, alone or with other neighborhood kids, weaving between imaginary defenders, taking jump shots with broken form and raw determination. There were no coaches, no drills, no encouragement, only repetition, sweat, and the unspoken hope that maybe, just maybe, this game could be his way out. The court was cracked and uneven, with weeds sprouting between the slabs. Drug deals happened on the corner. Police cruisers drove by with slow suspicion. But when Marcus played, he left it all behind. The rhythm of the ball on asphalt was a metronome in his chaotic world. It gave structure to the shapelessness around him. When he jumped, he felt weightless. When he ran, he felt free. Basketball became more than a sport. It was a language, a compass, a shield. It was the only thing that made sense. By the time Marcus turned 12, people started noticing. A high school assistant coach saw him play at a neighborhood tournament and told someone else, who told someone else. Soon, Marcus was being mentioned in conversations far beyond his block. He didn't fully understand what it meant, but he felt the shift. Strangers began showing up to games. Adults leaned in when he spoke. Teachers stopped treating him like a statistic and started calling him young man. But nothing changed at home. Denise still worked late nights. The fridge was still half empty. The rent was still overdue. Every step Marcus took toward potential success was mirrored by a heavier weight of responsibility. He began waking up before sunrise to run laps around the neighborhood, his breath visible in the morning chill. He'd return, drenched in sweat, and get dressed for school in silence. At night, he'd sneak back out to practice free throws by the dim glow of a nearby street lamp. There was no training facility, no personal coach, just raw desire and a growing sense that basketball wasn't just a dream, it was a debt. A debt to his mother, who gave everything without asking. A debt to himself for surviving long enough to have a chance. Every day he walked past boarded-up buildings, empty lots littered with broken glass, and memorials to boys who looked like him but never got out. He knew each block by heart, the smell of the bakery on 76th, the corner store where he bought 5-cent candy, the alley where he once hid during a shootout. All of it formed the fabric of his beginning. It hardened him, sharpened him, prepared him. He wasn't naive. He knew the world beyond his neighborhood didn't care about his struggle. They only cared if he could score points, sell jerseys, fill seats. But Marcus carried more than talent. He carried memory, grit, and the echoes of 1,000 nights when sleep came with one eye open. And still, each night, he returned to apartment 4B. The couch cushions were worn, the curtains were crooked, and the kitchen light buzzed like a trapped insect. But it was home. It was the place where his mother waited, where she reheated dinner and asked how his day went even when she was too tired to hear the answer. In that cramped apartment, amidst the noise of a broken city, a boy was becoming something else. Not a savior, not a star. Just a kid trying to run fast enough to outrun his own past. Marcus didn't know what the future held. He didn't fantasize about fame or fortune. He only thought about the next game, the next shot, the next breath. And in those moments, under the faint hum of distant traffic and the glow of a flickering street lamp, the concrete beneath his feet began to feel less like a prison and more like a runway. By the time Marcus turned 17, the whispers had turned into headlines. Coaches, reporters, and scouts now referred to him by his full name, as if saying it gave them a claim to his future. He was no longer just a boy from the South Side. He was a prospect, a commodity, a name floating on lists, mentioned in podcasts, and projected into mock drafts. At school, teachers who used to sigh at his lateness now asked for autographs for their nephews. Students who never spoke to him before suddenly found reasons to sit near him at lunch. The world had taken notice, and it was moving fast. He received offers from top-tier colleges across the country. Duke, Kentucky, UCLA, blue blood programs that treated 17-year-old boys like royalty before they even signed. Letters poured in, handwritten notes from legendary coaches, highlight videos with custom graphics, phone calls that started with charm and ended with subtle pressure. Everyone told Marcus he was on the verge of something massive, that his life was about to change, that he needed to think about legacy, branding, NIL deals, and national exposure. But while the world buzzed with the possibilities of what Marcus could become, his reality hadn't shifted an inch. At home, the electricity flickered if they ran the microwave and the heater at the same time. The rent was still behind. The bathroom faucet still leaked. His mother, Denise, worked more hours than any human should. She often came home with sore knees, calloused hands, and silence. She never asked about the offers. She never asked who called. All she cared about was whether her son ate and whether he slept. She knew the weight he carried before he did. Marcus had started counting bills instead of dreams. He watched his mom ration medication for her arthritis, stretch rice and beans through 3 meals, and quietly cancel her own doctor's appointments to save money. He had already begun to understand that talent alone couldn't fix poverty, but a contract could. A professional contract meant immediate cash, not promises 3 years down the line, and when the G League came knocking with a direct-to-pro offer, Marcus didn't hesitate. He wasn't thinking about banners or titles. He was thinking about utility bills, about groceries, about a new mattress so his mother could finally sleep without back pain. The decision caused a stir. Pundits called him reckless for skipping college. Some said he was setting a bad example. Others said he was chasing a quick check instead of long-term success. But none of them had lived in a building where heat was optional and safety was a luxury. None of them knew what it felt like to see your mother come home from work with tears in her eyes because she couldn't afford to fix her teeth. For Marcus, the offer wasn't a shortcut. It was a lifeline, a chance to grab the wheel before his whole life veered off the road. He packed his things quietly. No celebration, no party. Just a duffel bag filled with practice gear, a pair of worn sneakers, and the weight of an entire household on his shoulders. There were no photos on the wall, no trophies displayed in glass cases. Everything Marcus was carrying came from within: grit, pressure, responsibility, and the burning need to be more than just a name on a jersey. He didn't leave Chicago with excitement. He left with urgency. He wasn't chasing fame, he was running from generational struggle, and he knew if he stopped to look back, he might never make it forward. The training facility in his new city was everything he'd never had: polished floors, endless Gatorade, massage tables, personalized lockers, and a nutritionist who said words like recovery and caloric intake. It all felt surreal. But beneath the shine was a boy who hadn't even graduated high school, now learning how to be a man under a microscope. Every movement was analyzed, every practice filmed, every mistake replayed in front of coaches with clipboards and folded arms. He was no longer the big fish. He was a rookie with something to prove. Still, Marcus adapted quickly. His work ethic translated. He ran drills with precision. He studied film late into the night. He showed up early and stayed late. Coaches started nodding in approval. Journalists wrote pieces about his discipline, his humility, his promise. His name trended on draft boards. His first paycheck came, and with it, he sent money home. Not for clothes or gadgets, but to clear the rent, fix the heater, and finally replace the living room couch with the spring that poked Denise's back for years. But the more success he found, the more he began to feel something unexpected: distance. The city that raised him started to feel like a distant planet. He missed the smell of his block, the rhythm of neighborhood voices, the sound of kids playing on busted rims, and yet he couldn't return. Not yet. He told himself he needed to wait until things were stable, until he had more to show for his effort, until he could bring something back that felt permanent. It wasn't time. He wasn't ready. The media spotlight grew brighter. Sponsorships started trickling in. His social media exploded. He was no longer just a player. He was a symbol of hope, a success story in progress. But behind the posts and interviews was a boy who still triple-checked his bank app to make sure his mom's rent cleared, who still lay awake at night picturing her walking up those 4 flights of stairs with aching joints, who still felt that strange sense of guilt every time he ordered room service or sat in a 5-star hotel. He was making progress, but the burden hadn't lightened. It had only changed shape. He wasn't just carrying expectations anymore. He was carrying history, every sacrifice his mother made, every friend who didn't make it out, every silent meal eaten in the dark. And though the world praised his composure, his stats, his rise, Marcus knew the truth. He hadn't made it yet. He had simply bought himself a little time, and time in his world was the most expensive thing of all. Marcus's entry into the NBA was explosive. In his first season, he became a highlight machine, posterizing defenders, sinking clutch shots, and celebrating with a quiet intensity that made fans curious and coaches impressed. He wasn't loud. He didn't talk trash or pound his chest. He just played with surgical focus, like every possession mattered more than the last. Overnight, he was transformed from promising G League talent into one of the league's most watched rookies. His name trended weekly, his jersey sold out in multiple cities, and his face appeared on magazine covers and sneaker ads before his second month on the roster. He signed with a major shoe company and appeared in national commercials with slogans that turned his grit into marketable inspiration. He was invited to late-night talk shows, walked red carpets next to celebrities he had only ever seen on TV, and got verified on every social platform before he fully understood what that even meant. His agent negotiated endorsement deals that stacked his bank account beyond anything he'd ever imagined. Suddenly, Marcus had access. Private flights, exclusive parties, stylists, financial advisors, and a social circle that operated on a completely different frequency. He bought his first car in cash, a sleek black vehicle with doors that opened upward like wings. He moved into a penthouse apartment that overlooked the city skyline, with floor-to-ceiling windows and furniture that seemed too expensive to sit on. Every surface gleamed, every detail was curated. It was beautiful, sterile, and absolutely nothing like home. The silence in those rooms echoed differently. At first, he told himself this was success. This was what he had worked for. But beneath the luxury was an unease that grew slowly, like a hairline crack spreading through glass. He barely had time to process what was happening. His schedule was a blur of games, practices, press conferences, team meetings, and media obligations. Off days were rare, and when they came, he often spent them alone. His phone was full of new contacts, brands, agents, reporters, influencers, but the people who once texted him just to check in had started to fade away. His old friends from Chicago still called sometimes, but the conversations were getting harder. There were pauses he didn't know how to fill. They'd ask what it was like to ride private jets, to party with rappers, to live in places with valet parking and doormen. He'd tried to describe it, but everything he said felt like bragging or pretending. So eventually, he just stopped trying. His mother remained in the same apartment on 79th Street, refusing to move despite his repeated offers. She said it was familiar, that she wasn't ready to leave yet, that she didn't need anything fancy. Marcus wasn't sure if it was pride or fear or just stubbornness, but every time he offered her a new place, she changed the subject. She never asked for money, though he sent it anyway. He paid off her debts, hired a cleaning service for her building, and installed new locks on the doors. But whenever they video called, he could still see the same chipped paint behind her, the same weak light bulb flickering in the ceiling, the same stove with one burner that didn't work, and each time, a part of him felt like a fraud. The public saw a rising star, confident, successful, unshaken. But behind the camera flashes and curated smiles, Marcus was battling a quiet isolation. The higher he climbed, the harder it became to connect with anyone. At team dinners, conversations revolved around investments, luxury watches, and international properties. No one talked about growing up without heat or watching friends get buried before 18. At industry events, he mastered the art of nodding politely while mentally counting how many hours he had left until he could go home and be by himself. He tried dating, but found that most of the women he met in his new life were drawn more to his status than to his story. They liked the dinners, the backstage access, the name recognition, but they didn't ask about his mom or his neighborhood or how it felt to sleep with a hoodie under the blanket to stay warm. He craved depth but was surrounded by surfaces. And in that gleaming world of excess, he began to feel like a visitor, wearing someone else's clothes. The loneliness didn't come all at once. It arrived in pieces, the nights he sat in his luxury kitchen eating takeout alone, the mornings he woke up to silence in an apartment meant for entertaining, the texts he drafted but never sent to people who wouldn't understand what he was trying to say. He couldn't go back, but he didn't know how to be fully present either. He existed in a strange in-between space, loved by strangers, admired by peers, but disconnected from anything that felt real. He missed the simplicity of home, The smell of his mother's cooking, the rhythm of the city blocks, the sound of laughter spilling out from stoops and corner stores. Success had given him everything he once thought he wanted, and yet it had cost him a sense of belonging. He wasn't ungrateful. He understood the privilege of where he stood, but understanding it didn't erase the ache. The further he moved from where he came from, the more he felt like a shadow of himself, visible, celebrated, but untouchable. Even in games, his mind sometimes wandered. After hitting a big shot, he'd glance at the crowd and imagine his mother sitting there. She never came. She said it was too far, too loud, too much. He suspected there was more to it. That maybe she didn't want to see him in a world that had never been built for people like them. Or maybe she just wanted to keep one piece of him to herself, untouched by the fame machine that seemed to consume everything it touched. The pressure to perform never let up. A bad game brought criticism, headlines, speculation. A good game brought more expectations. He was no longer allowed to just play. He had to prove, maintain, defend, exceed. His identity became statistics, contracts, and sound bites. Fans loved the story of where he came from, but only if he kept winning. The minute he showed weakness, they'd move on to the next rising star. He understood that now. Loyalty was conditional in this world. Love came with performance clauses. And so, night after night, Marcus returned to the same apartment in the sky. He'd sit by the window, staring at the city below, wondering how something so beautiful could feel so far away. He had reached the top of a mountain he wasn't sure he even wanted to climb. And as the lights of the city blinked beneath him, he tried to remember what it felt like to just be a kid with a ball and a dream and a cracked court 2 blocks from home. It happened during a routine fast break, the kind Marcus had executed 100 times before without thinking. One dribble past half court, a quick stutter step to freeze the defender, and then a violent leap toward the basket. But this time, as he elevated for the dunk, something in his knee gave way. There was no pop, no dramatic scream, just an eerie moment of weightlessness interrupted by a sharp, internal tear and the sudden collapse of control. He landed awkwardly, crumpling to the floor as the arena gasped in collective confusion. For a second, he tried to stand, as if the force of will alone could undo what had just occurred, but his leg buckled again. The trainers rushed in, his teammates huddled around him. Cameras zoomed in while commentators speculated. And Marcus, lying on the polished hardwood beneath $100,000 worth of lights, stared blankly at the ceiling, not from pain, but from the quiet, creeping realization that everything was about to change. The diagnosis came quickly. A torn meniscus. 8 to 10 months of recovery. Surgery required. It wasn't career-ending, not in the modern world of sports medicine, but it was a detour, an unwelcome interruption in a journey built on momentum. The franchise issued a press release within hours. Fans flooded social media with sympathy, hashtags, and highlight compilations in his honor. But after a few days, the buzz dulled. The league kept moving. The team signed a temporary replacement. New stars emerged in his absence. The rhythm of professional basketball didn't pause for anyone, not even for prodigies. Marcus retreated into a world of rehabilitation and repetition. Mornings began with stiffness, ice packs, and slow, robotic movements that mocked the athlete he used to be. Physical therapists stretched his leg, monitored his progress, and reminded him that patience was just as important as effort. But Marcus wasn't used to waiting. His whole life had been about acceleration, about pushing through, about outrunning his circumstances. Now, confined to a training facility with machines and tape and cautious encouragement, he felt trapped inside a body that refused to obey. The silence was the worst part. No games to prepare for, no interviews, fewer phone calls. The entourage that once surrounded him began to thin. Friends who once called daily started texting weekly, then monthly. The media moved on to newer stories, younger rookies, fresher faces. He still received notifications, still saw his name pop up now and then, but the glow had faded. He was no longer a sensation. He was a question mark. Nights became long stretches of insomnia. He spent hours scrolling through social media, watching other players celebrate wins, post workouts, and bask in the attention he once claimed. He saw fans arguing about whether he'd come back stronger or if his breakout year had been a fluke. He tried to ignore it, to remind himself that recovery took time, but the doubts echoed louder in the dark. He thought about how fragile everything felt, how quickly a leap, a muscle, a ligament could rewrite a future. Loneliness crept in like fog. The walls of his apartment felt tighter. The panoramic views now seemed like reminders of everything he was separated from. He stopped answering calls from media outlets and canceled scheduled appearances. There was nothing to say. He wasn't playing, wasn't contributing. He had become an observer in his own narrative. In one of those long nights, Marcus stumbled across a video someone had posted online, a shaky phone recording from his old neighborhood. The caption read, "Same block, same pain." In the clip, a group of kids scattered as gunshots rang out. A boy in a hoodie collapsed near the corner store where Marcus used to buy candy as a child. The footage was raw, chaotic, and terrifyingly familiar. It didn't go viral. There were no headlines. Just another forgotten tragedy in a place the world had long learned to ignore. But for Marcus, it hit harder than any injury. He recognized the corner, the shadows, the desperation. That video wasn't just a window into a place he'd left behind. It was a mirror reflecting who he might have been if the ball hadn't bounced his way. He thought of his mother immediately. Still in that same apartment, still living under flickering lights and brittle ceilings. He had promised to get her out. He had promised to come back. But months had passed, and he hadn't visited. Hadn't seen her face except through pixelated screens and quick check-ins. His excuses no longer held weight. He couldn't blame the schedule or the travel or the noise. He just hadn't gone. Maybe because he was ashamed of how far he'd drifted, or maybe because facing her would mean facing the version of himself he tried to outgrow. He made the call late that night. Her voice was the same, tired, warm, wrapped in a familiarity that made his chest tighten. She spoke like nothing had changed, like time hadn't passed. But it had. And in that space between sentences, Marcus felt the ache of distance more than ever. He wanted to say so many things, to apologize, to ask for forgiveness, to tell her he wasn't okay. But the words caught in his throat, buried beneath years of pretending he had everything under control. The days that followed were quieter. He focused on his rehab with renewed purpose, not because he wanted to return to the spotlight, but because he needed to feel whole again. Not for the fans, not for the league, for himself. He needed to know that he could rebuild, not just his body, but his connection to what truly mattered. The fame had been loud, the fall had been silent, but in the stillness, there was clarity. Marcus began to write, not for anyone else, just for himself. Fragments of thoughts, memories of growing up, things he wanted to tell his mother, moments he wished he could relive. He started journaling every morning after therapy, letting his pain spill onto the page in ink rather than in isolation. And in doing so, he began to find his way back. Not to the game, but to the reason he started playing in the first place. The injury had stripped him of motion, but it had given him perspective. He saw now how far he'd drifted from the core of who he was. The kid on the cracked court, the boy running through alleys, the son of a woman who never gave up. That version of Marcus hadn't disappeared. He had just been buried under contracts, applause, and expectations. And now, in the quiet space between brokenness and healing, he could hear that boy again, whispering that it wasn't too late to come home. Marcus returned to the court with a body that had been rebuilt and a mind that had been rewired. The rehabilitation had not only strengthened his leg, but stripped away the illusion that he was invincible. He moved with more caution now, not out of fear, but with the quiet precision of someone who had learned the cost of carelessness. The first time he laced up his sneakers again in a real game setting, the noise around him was deafening, but the inner dialogue had changed. He no longer measured his worth by highlight reels or crowd reactions. Something deeper had shifted, something permanent. Though his team welcomed him back with open arms, and though the fans roared when his name was announced, Marcus felt like a visitor in the life he used to live. The penthouse still stood, immaculate and cold. The endorsements continued, the offers rolled in, and the media wasted no time in crafting a redemption arc that painted him as a fallen star reborn. But Marcus no longer saw the value in the narrative. He had outgrown the need to be mythologized. What he wanted now was something that couldn't be measured in statistics or social media metrics. He wanted connection. He wanted to feel real again. For weeks, the thought of returning to Chicago had lingered like a hum beneath every waking moment. He saw it in the steam rising from manholes in New York, heard it in the accent of an old janitor at the training facility, smelled it in the grease of fast food wrappers on late-night bus rides. Home had become more than a place. It was a presence, something he carried in his blood. But it was also something he had avoided for too long. Facing it meant confronting the spaces he had neglected, the relationships he had left dormant, the silence he had allowed to grow between him and the people who mattered most. He didn't tell anyone when he booked the flight. He chose a day when the team had no obligations, quietly packed a small bag, and left without ceremony. There was no entourage, no press, no announcement. Just a hoodie, a cap pulled low, and the quiet anticipation of walking familiar streets as a changed man. The ride from the airport to the south side was long, winding through pockets of the city that felt frozen in time. As the car moved deeper into the neighborhood, Marcus began to recognize buildings, corners, murals faded by sun and weather. Each landmark stirred something in him, a memory, a lesson, a bruise that had never fully healed. When he stepped out near his old block, the pavement felt different beneath his shoes. He walked slowly, taking in the details. The old playground where he first touched a basketball had new paint but the same bent rim. The corner store had a new sign but still smelled like stale gum and fried food. Some faces were new but others remained, older now, weathered by time, but still watching. Kids pointed, whispered, then approached cautiously, unsure if it was really him. He offered a nod, a smile, a few words, and kept walking. The air was thick with unspoken things. Reaching the familiar brick building on 79th Street, Marcus stood for a long time before entering. The stairs were exactly as he remembered, chipped, creaky, uneven. He could hear muffled sounds of life behind the doors he passed, televisions, arguments, laughter, crying babies. When he reached the 4th floor, his breath caught for a moment. The door to apartment 4B was still there, the paint peeling slightly, the same dent near the knob from a long-ago slammed backpack. He knocked once, and the door opened almost immediately. There were no dramatic reactions, no cinematic moments. Just his mother standing there, unchanged in some ways, older in others, eyes wide with 1,000 emotions compressed into one silent gaze. He stepped inside and was swallowed by the familiar. The couch was in the same place. The light in the kitchen still buzzed. The air smelled like old memories. Onions sautéing, laundry detergent, floor cleaner. He didn't speak right away, didn't need to. He sat down, exhaled, and felt the tension of years dissolve into the worn cushions. Time moved strangely in that room. The noise of the outside world faded. All that remained was the steady rhythm of a life that had waited patiently for his return. The next few days unfolded quietly. He stayed in the neighborhood, walked its streets, visited old teachers, nodded to the men who used to play dice outside the barber shop. He bought groceries with his mother, fixed a broken cabinet under the sink, replaced the light bulb in the hallway. Small things. Necessary things. Things that grounded him. He wasn't trying to make a statement or prove anything. He was trying to reconnect, not just with the place, but with the version of himself that had been left behind. He made arrangements to move his mother out, this time with no room for refusal. A modest house on a quieter block, away from the sirens and broken elevators. Not a mansion, not a palace. Just a home with working heat, sunlight, and space to breathe. She resisted at first, but Marcus had learned that sometimes love means insisting. He also set up a trust for kids in the neighborhood, a program that combined basketball training with mentorship and academic support. He didn't want to be a savior. He wanted to build something that lasted beyond applause. In those moments, Marcus began to feel whole again, not because he had returned as a star, but because he had returned at all. The distance he had created was not impossible to close. It simply required presence, humility, and time. The city hadn't changed much. Poverty still clung to its corners, violence still erupted in pockets, hope still flickered instead of shining. But his presence there was a reminder that survival could evolve into something more. That rising didn't have to mean abandoning, that greatness could coexist with grounding. He resumed playing soon after, and though his stats were solid, he no longer chased the headlines. He had redefined success for himself. It was in the handwritten note left by a local boy thanking him for showing up. It was in the way his mother laughed more freely now. It was in the way he slept deeper at night, no longer haunted by the guilt of forgetting who he was. Coming back hadn't been a moment. It had been a process, a series of small decisions, quiet steps, and difficult truths. And in that return, Marcus didn't just reclaim his past, he reimagined his future. Years passed, and with them came a quiet transformation in the way Marcus Hill lived his life. The flash of cameras and roar of arenas still played a role in his story, but they no longer defined him. His career continued, marked not by sensationalism, but by consistency, reliability, and a kind of mature grace that rarely made headlines but always earned respect. He was no longer the league's newest rising star, no longer the center of highlight reels every night. He had become something steadier, an anchor in a system obsessed with spectacle. His game evolved, smarter and more deliberate, less about explosive moments and more about impact that endured beyond the scoreboard. Off the court, Marcus had discovered a deeper sense of purpose. The projects he began in his old neighborhood had grown. What started as a modest community gym became a full-fledged youth center offering mentorship, tutoring, meals, and safe spaces for kids who lived in the same kind of uncertainty he had once known. He didn't put his name on the building. He didn't want a statue. He wanted results. The focus wasn't on creating the next pro athlete, but on building young people who could survive and lead, who could dream beyond escape, who could feel like their block was not a cage, but a foundation. The trust fund he created expanded, drawing in partners from the world of education, tech, and healthcare. Scholarships began to appear for kids who never would have considered college. Therapists and counselors were brought in to deal with trauma, not just behavior. Marcus showed up often, not for photos, but to listen, to watch, to remember. He kept a notebook in his car where he jotted down things kids said to him, questions they asked, fears they voiced. He used those words to shape new programs, to influence where money went, to inform how his team approached community care. He understood that real legacy was built through listening, not talking. His relationship with his mother deepened in ways neither of them could have imagined. The new house had become a haven not just for her, but for the extended family they both had learned to welcome again. Cousins, neighbors, even former teammates would stop by. Her living room became a hub of quiet wisdom and warm meals, where people came not for handouts, but for peace. Marcus would visit on weekends when he had time off, not as a celebrity son, but simply as her child, carrying groceries, fixing leaky faucets, and sitting with her on the porch in the late afternoon sun. The walls of her house were filled with photos, not of awards or red carpets, but of community events, group photos with kids, murals painted by neighborhood artists, graduation ceremonies of students he had quietly funded. Among them, near the kitchen, was a single-framed photo of Marcus at age 10, holding a basketball nearly as big as his torso, standing in front of the cracked garage hoop where it all began. Beneath the image, in gold letters, was a simple phrase he had chosen himself. "This is where I started, not where I'll end." Marcus became known not just as an athlete, but as a figure of grounded resilience. He was invited to speak at conferences and panels, asked to consult on policy for youth development, honored by foundations he once thought were for other people. He accepted the invitations, but always redirected the attention to the people he served. In interviews, he never indulged in self-congratulation. He spoke about his mother's sacrifices, about kids in forgotten zip codes, about the teachers who invested in him when no one else saw value. He made it clear that his story was never just his own. As he aged, his playing time slowly decreased, and the league began to look toward newer, younger talents. Marcus didn't resist it. He welcomed the change. He mentored rookies, shared advice in locker rooms, showed them how to carry themselves without losing who they were. He told them to call their families, to watch how they spent their money, to understand that the game ended. But their life didn't. Some listened, some didn't. But Marcus knew that planting seeds was part of the work. Not every tree would grow, but every seed mattered. When the time came to retire, there was no tearful press conference, no theatrical farewell tour, just a quiet announcement, a thank you letter posted online, and a final game played with calm dignity. He left the court that night with his head held high and his heart light. The noise of the arena faded into memory, but what remained was the echo of footsteps, his own and those of the kids who now walked paths he had helped clear. In the years that followed, Marcus remained active, but he no longer chased visibility. He built, he mentored, he wrote. He published a book, not a memoir, but a collection of essays and letters to his younger self, filled with lessons, confessions, and encouragement for those still fighting their way through concrete. The book became a quiet bestseller, passed hand to hand, classroom to classroom, block to block. It wasn't about Marcus Hill, the basketball player. It was about what it meant to survive and still care. He continued to live simply. He drove a modest car, wore clothes without logos, and kept his phone on silent more often than not. He smiled easily, laughed more, and worried less. The pressure to prove himself had long since dissolved. In its place was a steady clarity that he had done what mattered. He had left a mark not in stone or spotlight, but in lives touched, voices heard, futures altered. Legacy, Marcus learned, wasn't about being remembered by everyone. It was about being remembered deeply by a few. It was in the thank you notes written by kids he never met, in the stories parents told about how their sons stayed off the streets because of his gym, in the eyes of his mother as she watched the neighborhood change, not because of promises, but because of presence. He never chased luxury, not really. And in the end, he found something far greater, a life rich with meaning, a name not worn for status, but spoken with gratitude, a legacy measured not in millions earned, but in hearts moved. And that, he realized, was the real championship.